All right, so ready to dive in. We've got a big one today. Fred Brooks, legend. Computer science wouldn't be the same without him.
Absolutely, a giant in the field. And you've sent over some fascinating material on him.
Yeah, I mean, we've got excerpts from his obituary, bits from his book, The Mythical Man-Month, even some analysis of how that book's held up over time.
Which is really interesting because, you can argue that book's almost more relevant now than when it was written.
Right. Talk about stuff that's aged well.
Like fine wine. Or maybe a good algorithm constantly being refined, but the core principles hold true.
Exactly. And speaking of core principles, we got to start with the man himself. The obituary you sent. Wow. Designing the IBM System 360. Founding UNC's Computer Science Department.
And writing what many consider the book on software project management, even if it sometimes feels like nobody actually reads it.
Yeah, well, we're guilty of that too sometimes. But that's kind of our mission today, right? To really unpack Brooks's legacy, especially that famous Brooks's Law, and see if those ideas about building software, especially that surgical team concept, how do those hold up in our world of agile sprints and basically like infinite lines of code?
And you hit on a key point there, that feeling of Brooks' work sometimes being ignored, because his insights are probably even more relevant today than ever, especially if software gets more and more complex.
Totally. And you can't really talk about Brooks without talking about System 360. That wasn't just any computer system, was it?
It would be like saying the wheel was just some invention. It
Yeah.
revolutionized the field.
Okay, so for anyone who doesn't speak fluent computer science, what was so groundbreaking about it?
Imagine a world where every single computer spoke a different language. That was the pre-System 360 world. Brooks and his team, they brought order to the chaos.
And by order, you mean?
They made it possible to move software between different IBM machines. Before that, it was basically impossible. Each one was its own little island.
Oh, wow. So it was like the first step towards the kind of software compatibility we take for granted today.
A huge leap. A gamble for IBM, too. Poured billions into it. But it cemented their dominance for decades. And it paved the way for everything we use today. And don't forget about the 8-bit byte. Brooks was a champion for that, too.
The 8-bit what now?
The 8-bit byte, without it, no lowercase letters, we'd be shouting all the time.
Uh-huh. Oh, man. Emails would be a nightmare.
Tell me about it.
Okay, but then there's the Mythical Man-Month. I mean, come on, that title alone makes you want to know more, right? What is a Mythical Man-Month anyway?
Classic Brooks. Intriguing, little cryptic. But that title leads into one of his most famous and often misunderstood insights, Brooks' Law.
Which states?
Adding manpower to a late software project makes it later. How many times have you seen that happen?
Oh, God, countless. So many times you just assume more people equals faster work, and then...
Disaster. Because it's not always about manpower, is it? It's about coordination, communication.
Right, it's like trying to squeeze more lanes of traffic onto an already jammed highway. Sometimes it just makes things worse.
Precisely. More people, more communication overhead. Suddenly you're not coding, you're stuck in meetings explaining things. Plus, training those new folks takes time away from your experienced team. And some tasks. Just not easily divisible. Can't have 5 people write one line of code any faster, can you?
Nope, not really. So how do you avoid that trap? Brooks had some ideas about that, right? Something about a curtain.
The surgical team. He uses this great analogy, right, of a skilled surgeon leading this super coordinated team in the operating room.
So it's all about that precision.
Exactly. One chief programmer designs and writes the core code. Everyone else has a very specific role supporting them. Co-pilot, administrator, editor, all working in sync.
So you're basically saying we should be building our software teams like we're prepping for surgery. That's a pretty compelling image.
It's about maximizing efficiency, minimizing wasted effort, and that's something we can all get behind, right?
It's amazing, isn't it? Like the Mythical Man-Month. It's a classic, right?
Yeah.
But it was written back when like people were still figuring out how to send a man to the moon.
Crazy, right? And yet, so much of it still rings true today, especially when you think about the pressure to meet deadlines.
Tell me about it. Deadlines are like the one constant in software development, aren't they?
Always there, looming in the background. And what happens when a project falls behind?
Everyone panics.
Pretty much. And then the knee-jerk reaction. Throw more people at it, more hands, lighter work.
Right, but we just talked about that. Adding people isn't always the answer, especially not in software.
Brooks knew that. He understood that software development isn't a factory. You can't just add more workers to the assembly line and expect output to magically increase. It's a creative process full of
human elements, unpredictable human elements.
Exactly. Brooks talks about this distinction between essential and accidental complexity in software.
Okay, I think I'm following. So essential complexity is.
The inherent difficulty of the problem you're trying to solve. Think about, like, navigating a new city. Even with a perfect map, it's still going to be challenging.
Right. There's only so much you can simplify.
Exactly. Now, imagine that same city, but the map is full of errors. Streets missing, landmarks in the wrong place. That's accidental complexity. Stuff that just makes the process harder than it needs to be.
And in software, I'm guessing that translates to like buggy code, unclear instructions, just things
Yep.
that trip you up unnecessarily.
You got it. And those are the things we can control. We can't eliminate complexity altogether, but we can minimize the accidental kind. And Brooks had some strong opinions about how to do that.
Like what? Give us the wisdom of Brooks.
Well, he was a huge proponent of conceptual integrity.
Okay, and that means
Keeping a single, cohesive vision for the software throughout the entire design and development process, it's like having a blueprint for a building. Everyone involved needs to be working from the same plan.
so like if you're building a music streaming app, that shared vision might be what? Creating a completely seamless, intuitive listening experience.
Exactly. Every design decision, every feature added, it should all flow from that core vision.
And Brooks felt that kind of coherence is easier to achieve with a smaller team.
He did. And he wasn't afraid to get a little metaphorical about it. Remember the Tower of Babel?
Oh yeah, wasn't that like a biblical construction project gone wrong?
Exactly. Too many cooks in the kitchen, each speaking a different language. Chaos, confusion. The project falls apart.
And that's basically what can happen in software development when teams aren't on the same page.
Precisely. So how do you avoid that? Brooks had a few ideas. One was starting with realistic estimates.
Oh, easier said than done, right?
He called it the planning fallacy, our tendency to drastically underestimate how long things will take. Come on, admit it. How many times have you said, oh, this will only take a day or two, only to find yourself still wrestling with it a week later?
More times than I can count. But that's like human nature, right? To be overly optimistic about how long things will take.
Brooks knew this. He advocated for using historical data, consulting with experienced colleagues, even just building in a healthy buffer for unexpected delays. Never hurts to pad those estimates a little bit.
Better to underpromise and overdeliver, right? So, realistic estimates. What else?
Prototyping. Brooks was a big believer in building something tangible early on, even if it's rough around the edges. He famously said, plan to throw one away. You will anyhow.
Love that quote. So it's like acknowledging that the first draft is never going to be perfect.
Exactly. It's about uncovering flaws, testing assumptions before you've invested too much time and energy. Like building a scale model of a bridge before you start constructing the real thing.
So you can spot the weak points before the whole thing collapses. Makes sense.
And speaking of avoiding disasters, Brooks was also a big advocate for documentation and clear communication.
Of course. Because without that,
It's like that Tower of Babel all over again. Everyone's speaking a different language, working from different assumptions.
and the project falls apart.
Exactly. Brooks understood that documentation isn't just about writing down what you did, it's about creating a shared understanding. He even suggested writing the user manual first,
Wait, before you even write a single line of code.
before a single line of code, as a way to really nail down the system's purpose, its functionality. It forces you to think things through from the user's perspective.
That's really interesting. So it's like before you even start building, you're defining what success looks like.
Exactly. And Brooks didn't stop there. He also proposed using a project workbook as this central repository for everything. Specifications, design documents, meeting notes.
So like a single source of truth for the entire project. It's like the ultimate documentation, right?
Yeah.
Having everything in one place, accessible to the whole team. And he was talking about this way back when, like digital documentation was still kind of a new thing.
I know, right? Ahead of his time. He even kind of predicted the rise of open source software, talked about how reusing existing code could save time and money.
Which is interesting because you could argue that open source kind of goes against some of his other ideas, especially about small teams.
It's true, there's that tension there, because Brooks, he was all about conceptual integrity, that single vision driving the project.
Right, one mind guiding it all.
Exactly. But then you've got open source with what? Thousands of contributors sometimes? Totally different approach.
It's like, I don't know, comparing a perfectly rehearsed orchestra to a massive jazz improvisation, you know?
I love that analogy. Both can create something amazing, but the process? Totally different.
Right. So the question is, can you really have that same level of conceptual integrity, that unity of vision, when you have so many different people contributing?
$1 million question. Because Brooks, he argues that great software requires this tight coupling of design and implementation, and that's harder to achieve with a more distributed team, for sure.
But does that mean open source can't produce truly great software? I mean, we both know that's not true.
Right. Look at Linux, the backbone of what? Countless servers and devices. Open source. Or Firefox, a whole browser built by a global community. Amazingly successful projects that kind of defy Brooks's ideas about small teams being the only way to go.
So maybe it's about finding ways to adapt those principles for a different world, a different way of working.
Exactly. Maybe open source communities have figured out new ways to create that shared understanding, a different way to get everyone on the same page, even with all those voices in the mix.
And maybe it's about recognizing there are different paths to the same goal, right? Just like the world, the software itself is always changing, always evolving.
Yeah.
So are the ways we think about building it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that's why, even decades later, Brooks' work is still so valuable. Makes you think critically about the process, you know? Be mindful of the human factors just as much as the technical ones.
Absolutely. So as we're out here building the future, one line of code at a time, Brooks is that voice reminding us. It is not just about the code, right? It's about the people writing it, the shared vision, and finding that balance between structure and creativity.
Beautifully said. I think that's a perfect way to sum up the legacy of Fred Brooks.
He gave us a lot to think about, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Well, there you have it, a deep dive into the mind of a true pioneer. From those early days of System 360 to the insights of the Mythical Man-Month, Fred Brooks' impact on the world of software. It's immeasurable. And as we keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible with technology, his ideas will continue to guide us, remind us to be thoughtful, to collaborate, and to never, ever underestimate the human element in everything we build.